Cradle Mountain National Park in central Tasmania. It's enough to take your breath away. It's beautiful. But it's also in the path of the winds called the Roaring Forties, which howl in from South America. That means sudden weather changes. Dozens of hikers and tourists get caught out every year in this region, now and then with fatal results. The best known and most tragic case here happened more than 30 years ago.
In May 1965, a group of 3 teachers and 16 students from Launceston's Riverside High School began a 5-day hike along the overland track to Cradle Mountain. They'd spent months preparing.
I just checked, there's another word on
Rod
here.
Howell is now a teacher at Riverside High, but in 1965 he was one of those students on the trek.
And it was a trip that was the first time we'd gone overnight. We'd had some day trips, and it was just to see to have the opportunity to go bush, I think.
Diane Batten teaches physical education and psychology in Hobart. She too was a student on the trip.
We had a bushwalking club that had been running for a couple of years, and myself and some of the other students were very keen that we try this longer trip, and so we'd probably put some amount of pressure on staff to organise an extended bushwalk for us.
Ewan Scott was an athletic young student teacher doing the overland track for the second time. David Kilvert was a 14-year-old student just getting over a bad cold. Scott and Kilvert, 2 names joined by a common tragedy.
On the last day, the wind was really severe. There were very, very fierce winds. There was one gust of wind that knocked everybody but 3 people in the party flat.
And a blizzard hit suddenly. I can recall it was undulating. We had to walk in knee-deep snow at times, and some of it was uphill, which was pretty straining. Some of the party had trouble carrying packs, and I would have been included among those. We all seemed fairly tired. The party strung out a little, and the 3 teachers were basically scattered within the group of 19 in total.
Our hands were, well, they weren't really frostbitten, but it's that stage where they've been really numb and then they start to come back, which is extraordinarily painful.
I don't know if I became semi-conscious or what, but I'm not completely sure. I know I didn't carry my pack, others did, and I certainly had Ewan Scott supporting me for part of that way. You know, I had my arm around him, and he was keeping me going because I was exhausted.
We all stopped and ate, and I think that probably helped to revive those who were finding the going really difficult at that point. But that was before David Kilvert collapsed. When he collapsed, it was total. So it was a total collapse. He didn't go through any intermediate stages, so that his distress was sort of rather unpredicted.
And we left Scott and Kilvert, and they presumably were in real trouble even at that stage, probably about 4 o'clock. It gets dark there about 5 in May.
It was day 5 of the hike when the blizzard hit. The group split into 4. At the back, a teacher with 4 students stopped and made a primitive shelter and settled in for a cold night. Di Batten and 2 of the fittest students were sent ahead by Ewan Scott to get help. On descent, they saw scarred landscape. It was a new car park, not marked on any map they'd seen.
We didn't realise that we walked past the car park in the dark. The sad thing about that was that from the car park there was a road, which may have been a little longer, but could have been negotiated in the dark, that would have taken us to where the ranger station. And I think Scott had tried to explain that when we were leaving.
The advance group members were sheltered by thick woods when, in the dark, they came across a watercourse that looked too wide to cross.
That creek, in talking about the trauma involved in this sort of thing, probably gave me the most angst afterwards, because it was a thing that really stopped us from getting through that night. When we came back to the creek in the morning, we found we could cross it without much difficulty.
The teacher leading the 4th group, which included Rod Howell, made a deliberate and successful attempt to reach the nearest substantial shelter.
I recall it was dark, and we, instead of turning right, we turned left to seek the shelter of a boat shed. And we were able to get into the boat shed and take probably a third of the length of the boat shed to huddle, and there was nearly enough room to put our sleeping bags out as long as we sat up rather than lay prostrate. At least we knew we were in shelter, and we hoped the others were.
Scott and Kilvert weren't so lucky. The only ones still out there, and the going was tough. Scott had been carrying his young companion. At some point, on the edge of Hanson's Peak, there was a fall, and David Kilvert broke his back. Scott wrapped Kilvert in a sleeping bag and struggled on alone.
A ranger and maybe some others came and picked us up in a Land Rover soon after first light, once the front 3 had alerted him. And the realisation came to different ones of us during the morning that not everyone was back.
The back group of 5 made it out with only a few cases of frostbite. David Kilvert was found where Scott had left him. He'd died of exposure. Ewan Scott, fatigued by the night's efforts, collapsed just metres from the car park and less than 200 metres from the boat shed.
He made the most extraordinary and heroic efforts to bring everybody back safely. Ewan Scott had seemed so competent and fit and healthy and powerful. As a young person, you don't have a perception that somebody who seems to be in charge and able to do all these things is actually going to be somebody who'll die.
This is a tragic story with 5 key factors that made the difference between life and death. Can you work them out? We'll be back out there with our answers after the break. It took me about 15 minutes to build this, and the activity of doing it kept me warm as well. Shelter, no matter how primitive, can be pretty useful, and it was the key to survival in the Cradle Mountain experience.
Ultimately, we made shelter and we survived, and the back group of 4 only made very primitive shelter, and at least one of those girls went to hospital with frostbite, and the others were more badly affected physically than the others of us. And clearly the 2 who died didn't make shelter at all, so that's the crucial determinant of your fate, I guess.
So you'll get cold quicker if you think you're doing nothing and you feel helpless than you will actually if you think you're making a shelter or you're following some sort of plan.
Young David Kilvert started out on the wrong foot.